Age 15, Ashley's life takes an unexpected turn.
She met a guy, and she became pregnant.
I was worried she might even quit school, but the school put a daycare in.
After giving birth to a baby son in 1999, Ashley continues her education, getting straight A's.
She got a job, she worked, she went to school.
She would actually walk from the school over to the gas station where she was working. And then she'd get off, she'd go home, she'd give the baby a bath, she'd get up, she'd go to school and go do it all again. She was the best mom. She was super mom. I don't even know how she done it. She still graduated with honors.
And in the summer of 2002, moves into her own apartment.
It was a low-income apartment, but she was proud of it.
Then one day, somebody called me asking, "Where's Ashley?" So I go across to her apartment, knock on the door. She's not there. She just packed up some clothes, packed up her son, and she was gone.
It's like, poof, she's not here no more.
I had no idea. I had no idea for months and months until she called me and said, "I'm okay, Mom."
She was living down here in Beaumont with Terry.
Ashley moves 85 miles south to live with 34-year-old trucker Terry Barlow.
She was 17 when he met her.
We were like, "Ashley, he's almost old enough to be your dad. What are you doing?" And she was like, it's fine, it's not that big a deal."
I feel like she was looking for somebody to take care of her, and he was selling that, "I'm gonna take care of you and your baby."
She probably did want a role model for her son. On her own, it was probably scary. He could have given her a little security.
What's up? Yeah, I win first.
I won. I think Ashley was his little trophy. His young, pretty, smart trophy.
Get the thing out of my face.
Terry always had this big camcorder. He liked to record everything.
This is my house. This the old crib. This the inside our house, man. It's all right.
He was a truck driver. He was the breadwinner in the beginning, and Ashley was the one that stayed at home.
So he did things to make a little bit of money. He liked to flaunt money, too.
That's what this is, iPhone. Yeah.
That mommy's gonna take away as soon as we can figure out how to open the bag.
Touch screen. Eggs are everywhere. Just run and look. There's money everywhere.
He'd be happy-go-lucky, joking, laughing, and everything. Most people just thought he was a good guy. He's cool, he's funny, he makes everybody laugh. He invites everybody over to parties.
Look at this.
I remember he had a very loud laugh. You could hear him from across the yard whenever he'd start laughing.
I'm telling you.
They weren't like a huggy-lovey couple. They really weren't. They'd laugh and joke, and they'd have a good time together if Terry was in a good mood. But I don't remember ever seeing her kiss him. I don't ever remember seeing her hug him. It was a very, detached relationship.
My sister did everything. My sister took care of the house, the cooking, the cleaning, everything.
It wasn't long after she moved down there that she really started to put on the weight.
Why not be the big baby?
Because you thick, baby, you thick. Look at all that booty.
Down here in the South, being thick, that's a good thing. Or it may have been a good thing for him. I guess men like that.
I'm looking at my plate.
If he was filming, he was trying to, this is mine.
Shake that thing!
I'm gonna pump you up. But behind closed doors is you're fat.
Mama, zooming on me. I'm already big enough.
Oh, he would always think it was funny to joke about her weight. Some of those jokes I didn't care for.
Now we in and out into the next room. The treadmill we never use. She don't never use it.
Your self-esteem is most definitely gonna go down if the person, you're supposed to love or what have you calls you fat.
She wasn't the happy-go-lucky, giggly big sister that I remember. You could just tell she wasn't the same. She'd lost that spark. It wasn't until later that I found out that he had just got out of prison and had pretty much got with Ashley as soon as he got out of prison.
Everything was red flags for me. Just always in my gut knew he was bad news.
When you boys sitting at home in the rain, when you want to get good and thirsty, guess what you do? Get up, get you one of the good beers. Come over here to the fresh cooler right here. See the cooler.
Terry didn't drink constantly,
No, pop one open.
but if it was weekends or especially holidays, yes. And he'd always put on a big show for everybody, buying all kinds of liquor and beer for everyone. Yeah, he always wanted to make the appearance that he was more than he was.
There they go.
And then I found out later that he would do a lot of that, putting them in debt on credit cards so he could make everybody look like he was all that.
You could tell whenever he'd get drunk that he'd get mean.
First time I came down here and seen Ashley, there was a big black bruise on her arm. And I ran to her and I said, "Did he do this to you?" And she said, "Oh no, Mother, he did not." She tried to say she ran into a door or something. And I just knew better. It looked like somebody had punched her in the arm.
She would just look off or she would change the subject. I mean, there was no talking about what went on between them.
Santa done came. Look for some present with your name on it. Get out there and look it up. Let's see
It's
what-
Christmas Day, and Terry plays Santa.
Get in there and get that blanket off for you and go open your present.
I'm sleepy.
No, you should have been in bed last night. Get up.
He would get more agitated. He'd start yelling and cussing, and, just little things would set him off.
You better like that. You better not cry. You better not be bad. I'ma bust your ass.
I couldn't even go in their house without getting a sick feeling to my stomach.
I'ma bust you up. I'ma bust you up if you be bad.
You could feel it when you walked in the house, the anger, the evil almost. Like you could feel it.
I'ma bust you up if you be bad.
Ashley knew that whenever everybody was gone, if he was upset or angry, that he was going to hurt her.
I remember she showed up at my apartment just bloodied up. She had her stuff with her, but she wouldn't talk. She would never tell us what happened. And she stayed maybe 2 days with me and went back. Why didn't you leave? I can't answer that.
Maybe she didn't believe that it was as controlling, and maybe she thought that was love. Maybe she didn't know the difference.
Despite his controlling behavior, Ashley stays with Terry.
See how fast he's going over here.
Telephone.
3.1.
Telephone. Get the phone.
I know that was something she always wanted, was to have the big pretty wedding and the big pretty dress, and just to be the center of attention for a day. And he said, "No, I'm never going to get married again," because he had already been married and gotten a divorce. And I think that hurt Ashley, but eventually I think she accepted it. I really wanted Ashley to have a happy little family, because I knew that's what she wanted. She wanted the happy little life.
After 8 years with Terry, Ashley has a baby girl,
She's mommy's baby.
Trinity.
She was super happy she was having a little girl.
She would call me and we would talk about T names. It had to be a name that started with T. That I used to say, why does it have to start with a T? And of course, Terry is where it came from.
Dad, can stand up, Daddy.
She was a great mom.
Come get it. To come get the cars. Come on.
And he doted over her.
Do it.
That, I can honestly say, was the best time of their lives, that they were probably happy.
I don't catch you being bad.
2 years later, on December 15th, 2011, Ashley and Terry welcome baby Tyson into the family.
Wave at the camera, I'll let you go play the game.
I feel like she loved him way more than she should have. He made her into the woman that takes care of the house, the woman that cooks the food, makes sure the meals are on the table, washes the clothes.
He expected her to do everything, but don't get upset at anything he does.
She learned how to cook, and I guess she liked her cooking because she did. She got big.
Ooh, look at that.
Terry would call her fat, and you could tell it bothered her, but I think she got used to being body shamed by him.
Don't do it, Ashley. Don't be like that. Don't be like that, Ashley.
It was like he was poking fun, but there was an underlying meanness to it.
I'm looking at my plate.
I think he wanted her to feel like no one else would have her because he wanted to keep her for himself.
She was so self-conscious. She gained a bunch of weight. She didn't want to go out.
She couldn't go nowhere. She couldn't do anything, so she just sat at home and ate.
It's going down over here.
She would avoid certain chairs and stuff because she knew she couldn't fit in them. That kind of hurt me to see because that's how big she got.
And she would talk about it all the time. Oh, I need to lose weight. I want to lose weight.
Just wait till I'm as skinny as you are again, you know? And she did try to lose the weight, but it was hard because, like I said, she was doing everything for everybody all the time.
She was just living to take care of the kids, and whatever Terry needed taken care of, that's what she did.
Terry was keeping her in that cycle intentionally because as long as she wasn't happy, you know, she wasn't trying to get away.
Even though she wasn't happy, she was going to stay for Trinity and Tyson.
She wanted the best for them kids. She did. She wanted them to be able to do anything that they wanted to do. That's whenever she decided she was going to start going to school and stuff. Ashley got a job at the probation office, and they're the ones that got her into becoming a probation officer. So she started going to school.
But she did it. She graduated with a bachelor's degree. They hired her right off the bat. She became a probation officer.
To have 2 small children and do everything she did, oh, I was proud of her. I was very proud. She was young, beautiful, smart, everything he wasn't.
She portrayed everything like everything is fine, I'm happy, living the dream, living the life, but I don't feel like that's the way it was.
I think that he got her to a point where she felt that she was not good enough, not pretty, and not, you know, sexy.
Then, in 2017, Ashley's world comes crashing down.
She went through his phone. I think that's how she found out.
He was paying for another woman's apartment and paying her bills.
I thought it was disgusting because Ashley was working, trying to keep them above water, and he's paying bills on a whole nother household.
Like I was told, that was his woman. Ashley was just crazy baby mama.
That was his choice to go off and have an affair, but somehow it always turned around and it was Ashley's fault. Well, you made me do this, you know, and if you looked better, if you were skinnier, I would stay around. Yeah, it was always Ashley's fault.
I know they fought about it, and I told her, I was like, you know he's cheating on you. And she said, yeah, I know, but I'm not giving up like that.
She gave him an ultimatum of, you either leave and go with her, or you marry me.
I felt like I was looking at a car crash beginning to happen.
BB bought her that ring right there. I bought her that.
It's 2018, and Ashley gets the proposal she's been dreaming of.
Ashley called me and said, I'm getting married on August 18th. And I said, what? She already had the invitations.
She was just happy that she was going to get married. You know, something she dreamed about her whole life. I wanted to just shake her and be like, what are you doing?
I just knew in my heart, that's not what you need to do. You need to leave him.
She told me why she did it. Because he was with that woman and everybody knew about it. And she was like, I wanted to show them that I'm the one that mattered. I think he just did it to appease Ashley because she did everything for him. That's how I feel.
It wasn't about, you know, I love you, I want to spend the rest of my life with you like it should have been. It was like, I messed up, so I'll go ahead and do the thing you want me to do. And that was his way of keeping her. She was already trapped, but like the wedding, I felt like she was even more trapped.
It wasn't a happy occasion for my sister. He had threatened to call it off like the night before, and she's stressed because they had mortgaged their house to have this wedding.
August 17th, 2018, the night before her big day. Terry vanishes, and Ashley goes searching for him.
She had to pull him out of a truck because he was so drunk he couldn't even walk.
Terry showed up to his wedding with sunglasses on.
The night before the wedding, he was so drunk, his eyes were so bloodshot that he wore the glasses to hide the fact that he was just messed up.
I thought to myself, why did she still marry him? Why?
She looked very pretty, but it wasn't a happy wedding that it should have been. It felt like everybody in the whole room was watching my sister look like a fool.
And I wanted to be excited for her, but I did not go to the wedding. And it's not that I didn't want to be there for Ashley, it's just that I wanted her to leave him so bad.
Ashley said, well, he's taking it as if our entire life started over when we got married, but that's not the way it works.
He got me doing for his birthday. We doing the damn thing.
A year after getting married, Ashley and Terry go on vacation with friends to Cancun, Mexico.
We gotta rejuvenate to get back.
While they were there, one of his people told Ashley that he was having another affair. It was like the switch had finally flipped for Ashley. She wasn't going to be unhappy anymore, and she wasn't going to let him be the reason she was unhappy anymore.
That's when she decided she was going to have the weight loss surgery, and she did.
She was losing weight, and she was sticking to the diet really well. I was like super stoked because I was like, I can't wait to see what Ashley's going to do, you know?
It was like watching a transformation, making sure she got her workout in, going to the personal trainer. So she did a complete 360.
We started seeing her smile again. And I was just so happy to see Ashley back.
Let me go hit the thing right here right quick. Let me hit that thing.
Terry was threatened. She would just make little remarks about how he didn't want her to go to the personal trainer. She told me, he thinks I'm still a little girl. I'm a grown woman now. So yeah, he was threatened. Her daughter, Trinity, had a very hard time. She couldn't tell me why they were fighting. All she could tell me was that Terry held her mom down on the floor and had a gun in her mouth, and it was loaded.
He had knocked Ashley over on the couch and put a gun in her mouth. And Ashley was trying to get Trinity to call 911.
And he told Trinity that if you call anybody, I'm going to kill her.
But again, Ashley would not tell me anything.
So Ashley probably lived in more terror than I'll ever know because she hid it from me.
In September 2021, Terry moves out.
Amanda told me that Ashley's finally going to divorce Terry. I think everybody was ecstatic.
She started making plans, and she was doing all the work. She found him an apartment, bought furniture for the apartment with her check, and he realized that Ashley is serious. So he started following her around. She didn't tell me he was pulling guns on her, but from the look on her face, I knew she was scared.
She said, "Mom, why won't Terry leave me alone?" I said, "Men don't go through divorces well. They're not like women, they just can't handle it." And that's what I said. And I wished I'd have said more. Because I didn't know that was the last time I would talk to her.
To escape Terry, Ashley moves in with her sister.
She had moved over to Amanda's house, and she was living there with the kids. They were all planning to cook dinner, and they were making ribs.
But I called Ashley, and I was like, "Ashley, make sure that, Mom don't mess up the ribs." Ashley had told me that she was going to pay the sports coach, and she was going to come right back. But she never ended up coming back.
On the evening of October 23rd, 2021, a business owner called 911.
Hello, 911.
He observed a disturbance between one of his clients and her husband.
There's a guy here with a gun at my shop. Where at?
He doesn't identify him other than it's a guy with a gun chasing us around.
Stop! 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 Stop!
The suspect was pointing a firearm, making verbal threats.
He's chasing me with a gun. You said somebody's chasing you with a gun? Yeah, now he's back around the corner. Oh my God.
That's a top priority call. Any type of disturbance, but especially one that we know there's a weapon involved. So immediately they get multiple units to respond to this location to try to catch the suspect.
What does he look like, sir? His name's Terry. He's a black male, 52. Terry? Okay. Why is he chasing you with the gun, though? Because his wife was there? Yes. No, he's dropping off now.
Multiple units are heading to that location. But within minutes, the suspect decided to return, and this is when everything went to absolute chaos.
Ashley hadn't been gone 25 minutes. I had my phone right here, and it said, "Terry." I looked at it, and something told me answer the phone. And the first thing he said was, I shot Ashley. I shot Ashley.
And that's when Amanda started calling me, screaming that he killed her, that he killed Ashley. I don't know, my body just went into shock, I guess. And I told her to call 911.
I am trying to get to my sister on College Street. He just told me he shot her. What's his name, ma'am? His name is Terry Barlow.
I knew where to go because she said, "I'm going to pay the sports coach."
After our male victim realized the coast was clear, he got back on the phone, called 911.
Can you get them here? The dude came back and opened fire and shot her. Then the cops pulled up. Okay, talk to the police. We'll get EMS headed that way. He came back and shot her.
When the responding officers arrive at the scene, they find a very distraught male victim. He was shaking, he was upset, he was clearly frightened for his life. But once he was able to compose himself, he was able to tell us that our suspect is a man by the name of Terry Barlow. All units were actively looking for this man. Our victim was Ashley Barlow. She'd had multiple gunshot wounds throughout her entire body. It was a very disturbing crime scene.
The cops are already here! Ma'am, Ma'am.
When I got there, she was just laying in like the middle of a parking lot. And I just remember saying, why aren't y'all doing anything? Why aren't y'all doing anything? They were like looking at me and shaking their head. There's no words that can describe the way you feel when you pull up and see your sister dead, shot down in the middle of a street like a dog.
And then Terry came back. He came back and tried to pretend like he didn't know what was going on, what happened to my wife. And Amanda lost it. Amanda tried to get to him, but the cops held her back. She started screaming, you know, that's killed my sister. And I guess that's when they put him under arrest.
When I get there, I'm able to observe the scene, observe the body. I'm advised that our suspect has been taken into custody.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Patrol officers had already taped off everything with crime scene tape and had Mr. Barlow in the back of a patrol car. We start collecting evidence, taking pictures. I saw numerous shell casings everywhere. There was a 38 and a 40 caliber. We knew there was at least 2 different handguns, but they were not there. There was also a GPS tracker that was laying next to her, which was odd.
Where she was hit was very close range, front of her face and her chest. I knew right away this wasn't just something that got out of hand, a sudden passion type deal. This was somebody that was exacting their violence in a very personal way.
We were unable to find any handguns there, but we did notice one of the businesses did have cameras.
Their video had audio. We were able to hear everything from the first disturbance to when the actual homicide took place. He chases down his wife as she's absolutely begging for her life. He takes her out and shoots her multiple times, and then has the audacity to tell her it's her fault. Look what you've made me do. I have not seen anything so cold-blooded. And as she's laying there mortally wounded, continues to fire on her.
He executed her.
That was horrible. Cold-blooded killer. At that moment, Terry's in the back of a patrol car. You just got to clear any personal biases of what you just saw, and you got to give him a fair shot as well of telling you his side of it.
You know, be Detective Sergeant Barrero, not Yvette Barrero, the person that just is enraged.
Hey, Mr. Barlow.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Sergeant Barrero with the Beaumont Police Department. Obviously, you know what you've done here tonight. What I need to do...
I messed up bad.
I wanted to let him know that I was willing to listen to what he had to say, even though I'd seen the footage.
I know, baby. It's going to be all right.
I love my wife.
It was vital that I reach out to him so that I could build some sort of rapport with him so that he would feel comfortable in telling me what led up to this horrific act.
We all mess up in life. The most important thing going forward here is to make this right.
We just wanted to know what happened that night, and we needed him to do that. Our main goal is what happened, what led up to this, and especially what did he do with the weapon.
Terry Barlow is interviewed by detectives after fatally shooting Ashley.
Me and my wife, we've been fussing. Well, I come home from work, and she said that she wanted a divorce.
Okay.
After 20 years, you ain't gonna tell me why? And she said she just needs space. So I say, okay, if you need space, and we're gonna work on this, I'll move.
By the time we got to the station, I'd learned that he had placed a tracker on her car and that he'd been following her and knowing every step she took.
I bought this tracker and I put it on the car. Today, it popped up. And I said to myself, I'm gonna go over here, find out what's going on. It didn't go right.
Terry was mad and upset that Ashley was standing there talking to another male subject. He pulls up, he gets out, and he confronts Ashley, and he doesn't remember what happened next.
She would want me to turn myself in and do the right thing.
He's telling us he wants to do the right thing. I just wasn't believing it.
Terry, I know you said that you knew that you had hurt her. Did you know when you left how severe it was?
No, I didn't know.
I'm thinking, man, you really are a callous, evil, selfish person for doing what you just did, but making this all about you.
Did you think about calling 911 to get her some help?
I didn't know what I had done. I just know that she needed me. She needed me. And I was going back because she needed me.
He's telling us that he's messed up. But when we get down to the brass tacks of it, what'd you do with the weapons? Then all of a sudden he has memory losses.
So you dumped the 380 over there off Laurel. Did you do the same with the 40?
I don't remember, ma'am. And once I got going, all I started thinking about was my kids.
He has no idea we have video footage of the homicide and how brutal it was. That just goes to show the type of monster he really was.
Do you think you might have tossed it out the window?
I don't remember, and it's killing me because I don't want nobody to get there and hurt somebody else.
It's like he wanted us to know almost everything except the part where he's the most guilty.
And not helping us find the weapon. Everything that he was doing that night was trying to set up for his defense.
You're under arrest for the murder of your wife and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
So when he's arrested that night, he's transported to Jefferson County Jail. And the following morning, he was arraigned by a judge for the charge of murder.
We have video that shows the murder. We have a GPS tracker. We have shell casings. What we don't have is the actual murder weapons. And we know there's at least two because we found two different shell casings.
424, but it's 2.
Hey, I found the gun, and it matches up with what y'all said. So, Smith & Wesson single stack 380.
So the night of the incident, we are able to locate one of the weapons. We were able to take that into custody. That's solid evidence, but we still needed to find the second weapon. I ended up going to her place of employment to speak to coworkers. When I go into the office, I see a bouquet of flowers on her desk and a letter written from the suspect. In the letter, he professes his love for her and how he wants to stay married with her. He had already moved out, but this is when you start to see the desperation. And this is just another added clue as to why he did what he did, because domestic violence isn't about the physical act itself. It's about controlling an individual. And he was absolutely losing the control he exuded over her for so many years. She was at that finish line, about to cross it over when he snuffed her out.
Two days later, police received footage from a second surveillance camera.
This video was absolutely the nail in his coffin, so to speak, because this angle was directly in front. When you put the two videos together and you hear the audio from this one and then what's actually occurring, it still gives me nightmares. You could just see the pure evil in his intents and his actions. We see how he shot her point blank. She pled for her life and could not do anything. He reloaded, exchanged weapons, and we now see him, the pure malice and evil snuff her life out. He tried to say at one point she reached for the weapon. He didn't remember how many times he shot. He didn't remember what he did with the weapon. This video shows us that everything he was saying was completely made up.
The autopsy confirms 2 different guns were used to kill Ashley.
That just kept us really laser focused on trying to track down that second weapon, and we weren't going to give up. I don't know how many times I walked around there looking and crawling in ditches. Fortunately for us, we got some divine intervention.
A homeowner doing yard work discovers the second gun.
The second weapon that we recovered was a .40 automatic Smith & Wesson.
Later testing showed that it matched the shell casings that was used in Ashley's homicide. So we finally found Terry's gun.
So there was no doubt that this was an execution. He brought multiple weapons to carry out this hatred.
Prosecutor Philip Smith is assigned to the case.
I worked in the 252nd District Court. Ashley was the probation officer in the courtroom next door. So everybody is understandably upset that one of our own has been taken in this manner. In this case, we were fortunate to have high-resolution video from across the street. The evidence had been gathered. The police had done a great job.
We had all the evidence in the world to show that he was guilty.
Terry enters a plea deal, and sentencing begins.
He tried to put blame on Ashley for why he did it. He had a gun, but she was reaching for the gun in his pocket. The video showed that was not true. She was in fact running away from him when he takes the gun out and starts shooting at her. He's also putting blame on a deceased person for making him do it. And that's telling. That's a narcissist.
To sit there on the stand, to me, was disgusting. Listening to him try to make excuses for what he done. I really loved her. Well, if you really loved her, how could you do that? Love does not do that.
You have to be so self-absorbed, so narcissistic, and so unconcerned, unmoved by the pleas of a dying woman that you fire 3 more bullets into her body as you stand over her, screaming at her, "Look what you made me do. This is your fault." That's a heinous person.
Terry pleads guilty to Ashley's murder and the aggravated assault of the sports coach. He's sentenced to 50 years.
That basically means he'll never see the light of day again. You know, he'll see his judgment one day, and he'll have to account for that. It'll be far worse than what happens here on Earth.
I think the world is a better place with Terry Barlow in prison.
And the only time I want to hear that man's name is whenever it's in an obituary. I felt like Terry stole Ashley a long time ago. You know, everybody else talks about losing Ashley the day she died. But I lost Ashley when Terry took her.
I think she thought I was stronger than her. And I wasn't. She was strong. She was so strong. And she endured so much, and she still continued to take care of her kids. She was a good mom.
I want Ashley to be remembered as the kind person that she was. I want the kids to remember what a great mother she really was to them, as I hope it never fades from their memory.
I want Ashley to be remembered for her perseverance. That you can have just the most horrible things happen to you, but you can still stand up and grow and be a beautiful person. I think she won in the end. I do. I think she won that battle in the end because she got what she wanted. She did not want her kids raised with him, and that's That's what happened. He's not raising them kids.
It's never going to ever be over because she was my baby. She was my daughter that I raised and was so proud of.
Wichita, Kansas. Can look harmless at first glance. Wide streets, trim lawns, front porches with wind chimes nudged by the prairie air. Church parking lots filling on Sunday mornings, grocery carts rattling over asphalt under a pale Midwestern sun. In a place like that, evil does not arrive wearing a monster's face. It arrives in ordinary shoes. It carries a clipboard, smiles at neighbors, remembers names, asks about your children, and stands under fluorescent lights as if it belongs there. That is what made the BTK case so chilling. It was not only the violence, it was the patience, the waiting, the way terror moved through Wichita like something invisible and intelligent, slipping under doors, settling into living rooms, breathing in the dark while families slept. Long before police knew who he was, long before the country learned the name Dennis Rader, there was only a string of broken homes and a voice that kept surfacing out of nowhere, cold and methodical. Wanting to be seen, wanting credit, wanting to be feared. He named himself as if branding a product. Bind, torture, kill. 3 words clipped into initials so blunt they almost sounded clinical. Except nothing about them was clinical. They were a promise. They were a ritual. They were the nearest thing this man had to a signature. And when those letters began to circulate through the city, they turned ordinary life into something shaky and uncertain. A mother pulling curtains at dusk did it with a new kind of tension in her shoulders. A father checking the back door checked it twice. Children were told not to wander, not to trust, not to answer, and all the while, somewhere inside that same city, the man behind those letters was going to work. Driving familiar roads, blending into the background as neatly as a nail pressed into wood. This story does not begin with sirens. It begins with stillness. It begins with that particular stillness of an American suburb in the middle of winter, when the afternoon light fades early and houses begin sealing themselves against the cold. You can imagine the sidewalks carrying the last footsteps of the day, the faint smell of dinner beginning to rise from kitchens. Television glow collecting behind curtains, the sense that night is arriving exactly as it should. Then imagine something else moving inside that calm, something watchful, something rehearsing. A man with fantasies so old and so carefully fed that by the time he acted, he was not improvising at all. He was stepping into a private script he had been writing in his head for years. That is one of the most unsettling truths at the heart of this case. BTK was not chaos. He was process. He was routine wrapped around sadism. He studied, stalked, prepared, imagined, relived. He did not simply lash out in a moment of rage and vanish. He built episodes. He created ceremonies of control. He watched the fear his crimes generated and seemed to draw energy from the idea that an entire city was unconsciously sharing space with him. There are killers who burn fast and disappear. Dennis Rader stretched himself across decades. He turned time into part of the horror. From 1974 to 1991, 10 people were murdered in ways that left behind not only grief, but a feeling that the boundaries of home had been violated beyond repair. Home is supposed to be the line between the world and the people you love. It is where shoes come off, where voices soften, where children fall asleep believing walls mean safety. BTK made the home itself feel fragile. He made windows seem porous. He made locks sound theoretical, and because he often chose moments so ordinary. Mornings beginning, afternoons fading. Routines unfolding exactly as usual. Every American ritual of domestic life seemed to darken around the edges. That is why this case lingered in the public imagination long after the murders stopped. It was not just the body count. It was the atmosphere he left behind, an atmosphere of violation, humiliation, and dread. But if you look closer, another element begins to emerge. One perhaps even more disturbing. Dennis Rader was not some drifting phantom living outside society. He was inside it, embedded. He had a job. He had a family. He attended church. He wore the face of reliability. That contrast is where the nightmare deepens, because people like to believe that monstrous acts require a visibly monstrous person. BTK denied that comfort, the same hands that handled daily tasks, that opened doors, that sorted papers, that shook other hands in daylight, also tied knots in secret, wrote taunting messages, and carried an inner life so warped it fed on domination. There is a special horror in that split. It means the danger was not just in dark alleys or abandoned roads. It was in the architecture of normalcy itself. It was behind a polite nod, inside a routine, hidden in a man whose life, from the outside, might have looked painfully average. And perhaps that is why the case still grips people now, because it forces a question no one wants to sit with for long. How well do we know the people around us? How much of a person is theater? And how much is basement? What locked room inside someone else's mind might exist for years without ever showing its true shape? The BTK story is not merely the chronicle of a serial killer. It is the story of performance, of ego, of a man who wanted absolute control over vulnerable moments and then wanted to narrate those moments back to the world as proof of his existence. He wanted to frighten, but more than that, he wanted authorship. He wanted his crimes to be read as messages. He wanted police to feel challenged. He wanted newspapers to carry his chosen name. He wanted immortality, not as a human being, but as a shadow cast over other people's lives. And for a long time, he got exactly what he wanted. There were dead ends, years of silence. Then contact again, letters, packages, clues placed like bait. Every time the case threatened to fade into memory, he seemed unable to tolerate the idea of being forgotten. That hunger to be recognized would eventually help bring him down, but at the beginning, that ending did not exist yet. At the beginning, there was only a city trying to understand what kind of person could do such things, and then return to ordinary life as if nothing had happened. There was only fear spreading in rings, from one neighborhood to another, from one headline to the next. A mother hears a report and reaches for her child without thinking. A husband checks the garage. A teenager lies awake listening to the house settle. The heater clicks on. Pipes murmur in the walls. A branch scrapes lightly at a window. And suddenly that harmless sound does not feel harmless anymore. That is how terror works when it is intimate enough. It colonizes the imagination. It teaches people to suspect the texture of their own lives. By the time BTK became a legend, the damage was already far larger than the scenes he left behind. He had taught strangers to picture themselves where the victims had been, and in those years before his capture, there was always the possibility that he was watching someone else, somewhere else, building another private fantasy around another family who had no idea their routines were being studied. That is the hook of this case. But also its wound. Not one dramatic night, not one single spectacle, a long campaign of intrusion, enacted by a man who looked, to many, like nothing at all. A predator who understood the power of anticipation. A killer who treated waiting as part of the act. A man who could stand in daylight and appear so unremarkable that he became, in a sense, the perfect disguise for himself. When people later saw Dennis Rader after his arrest, many had the same reaction. Him, that face, those glasses, that voice. It is almost insulting, the banality of it. You expect some visible clue, some stain that the eye should have caught years earlier. Instead, you see a middle-aged man with the posture of an office worker and the expression of someone explaining utility rates. Then the details of what he did begin to rise around that face. and the mismatch is almost unbearable. It is like hearing that a quiet room once contained a storm strong enough to tear through generations. The BTK case asked the audience to live inside that mismatch, to understand that horror does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it files itself into the neat drawers of community life and waits there. Patient, self-satisfied. Unseen. Sometimes it is not the stranger in the distance, but the familiar shape at the edge of the frame. That is where we enter this story, in Wichita. Under calm skies and ordinary routines, where fear first had no face. Only aftermath. No body in handcuffs. Only absences, no confession. Only a set of initials crawling into public consciousness like a stain that would not wash out. Before the courtroom. Before the headlines naming Dennis Rader. Before the city could finally attach the nightmare to a single human body. There was this awful in-between period when the killer existed more as a presence than a person, and in some ways, that presence was worse. A nameless threat can become anything in the mind. It can be every parked car, every unexplained creak, every silhouette near a fence line, every delayed call home. It can grow larger than the truth, because the truth has no edges yet. So as we begin, do not picture only the man who was eventually caught. Picture the void before that. Picture Wichita living beside an invisible animal that moved on 2 legs and wore a neighbor's face. Picture the first families who did not know they were being watched. Picture police departments still trying to connect patterns. Picture reporters handling envelopes that transformed rumor into something official. Picture a killer writing those stories somewhere in private. Pulse lifting not from remorse but from satisfaction. He had found a way to enter people's homes without always opening the door. He had entered through dread, and once dread is inside, it rearranges everything. It sits at the dinner table. It follows children down hallways. It waits in the bedroom after the lights go out. That is where our story begins, not with what Dennis Rader looked like, but with what he made an entire city feel, and that feeling had a texture. It was the texture of curtains drawn a little earlier than usual, of neighborhood conversations that lowered when children came close, of local news broadcasts left on in kitchens because silence felt worse. Wichita in the 70s and 80s was not a city that imagined itself as the stage for a prolonged psychological siege. It had the rhythms of work, school, church, shopping centers, school plays, winter coats hanging by front doors, sprinklers hissing in summer yards. The violence that would come did not erupt in a world already broken open. It entered a world arranged around predictability. That contrast matters because predators like BTK exploit exactly that trust in routine. He understood schedules. He understood how people lean on habit because habit feels like safety. Leave for work at this hour, return home at that hour. Kids in school, husband away. Door sometimes unlocked for a moment, blinds half open. Dog in the yard. A life becomes legible if watched long enough. And Dennis Rader was a watcher before he became a name in police files. He was a collector of glimpses, a man feeding private fantasies with real people's movements. Real houses, real moments of vulnerability. He did not merely want victims, he wanted scenarios. A stage set to his liking, a sequence he could anticipate and then force into the direction he desired. That attention to control is part of what makes the opening chapter of the BTK case so unnerving. You are not looking at lightning. You are looking at weather building slowly beyond the horizon while no one yet understands what is forming, even now. With the ending known, the mind keeps returning to those unseen hours before the first major headlines. Before the city learned to associate terror with 3 initials, somewhere. Dennis Rader was nursing grievances, fantasies, and compulsions that had already begun to harden, somewhere. He was telling himself stories in which other people became objects in his script, somewhere. He was discovering that imagination alone no longer satisfied him. There is a dark threshold in cases like this. A moment when fantasy stops being rehearsal and starts demanding embodiment. We rarely see that moment directly. We infer it from what follows, but it matters because once a person crosses it, the world around them becomes material. Houses become targets. Families become possibilities. The ordinary map of a city becomes in the mind of the predator, a hunting ground disguised as community. And still, no one around him may notice anything more alarming than a stiffness in his manner, a need for control, a personality slightly too fond of rules. That is the cruel irony. The beginning of a serial crime story often unfolds in total privacy, beneath the threshold of ordinary social detection. By the time the public sees the first piece of it, the killer has usually been living with the idea for far longer than anyone realizes. So when we open on BTK, we are opening on two Wichitas at once. One is the visible city, lit by porch lamps and school gymnasiums and office fluorescents. A city of errands and obligations. The other exists only inside one man's hidden appetites. A secret Wichita made of windows, vulnerabilities, and imagined scenes of control. Those two cities are about to collide. And when they do, the visible city will spend years trying to understand how it was being translated, without consent, into the private theater of someone it had failed to identify. That is why this hook is not only about fear, it is about disorientation. The sense that reality itself has developed a second layer you cannot see, but someone else can. A layer where your daily life is being read differently than you intended. A layer where an outsider has turned your home into a diagram. Once that possibility enters public consciousness, every normal thing begins to feel unstable. And that instability, more than any single headline, is the first true sign that BTK has arrived. In the years ahead, detectives would chase evidence, families would carry grief, and the city would finally learn the name behind the mask. But here, at the threshold, there is only quiet and something terrible moving inside it. If part 1 was the moment the lights dimmed, part 2 is where we begin to see the room itself, to understand why the BTK case sank so deeply into the American imagination. You have to understand Wichita before it became a city that people associated with a nameless predator. In the 1970s, Wichita was not a place that advertised menace. It was a working city in the center of the country, shaped by aircraft factories, church life, family routines, and a kind of plain-spoken Midwestern order. There were neighborhoods where children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, where dogs barked behind chain-link fences, where garage doors opened at the same times each morning and closed again with the same metallic shutter each evening. There were school cafeterias and bowling alleys, hardware stores and grocery aisles, church basements smelling faintly of coffee and old hymnals, and all the little repeated rituals that make people feel they know the place they live. Wichita did not look like the backdrop for a long private war between one man's fantasies and the fragile safety of ordinary families. That contrast matters, because BTK did not emerge from a landscape already coded as dangerous. He emerged from normal American life, from the same lawns, offices, churches, and family schedules as everyone else. The horror of the case would rest, in part, on that unbearable proximity between the everyday and the monstrous. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 and grew up in Kansas in a world that, from the outside, would not have seemed extraordinary. He was not raised beneath some gothic storm cloud that would let the future announce itself early. He came from the sort of environment that produced countless men who went on to work jobs, marry, raise children, and fade into the background of the American century. But hidden beneath that ordinary surface, according to later accounts and his own statements, violent fantasies had been taking shape long before the city knew his chosen initials. They did not arrive all at once. They accumulated, he nurtured them in secret, fed them with images of bondage and control, and built an interior world in which domination was not a passing impulse, but an organizing principle. That private imagination would become one of the central engines of the BTK case. Before there were victims, there was rehearsal. Before there were headlines, There was fantasy before there were police files. There was a man learning to split himself in two. On one side stood the version of Dennis Rader that the world could see. He served in the Air Force. He later married Paula Dietz. He had children. He studied criminal justice. He held jobs that, on paper, sounded practical and deeply ordinary. He moved through institutions of discipline and routine. He learned how to function inside systems, how to obey when necessary, how to imitate respectability. The public face he cultivated was not charismatic in any dazzling sense. It was narrower than that, more useful than that. He could appear dutiful, structured, perhaps controlling, perhaps rigid, but never so visibly strange that the world would stop and stare. The other self, however, was built in silence. In that private chamber of the mind, people were no longer neighbors or strangers with inner lives of their own. They became targets, props, figures and scenarios he could script. That inner life matters because BTK was not primarily a killer of spontaneity. He was a killer of anticipation. He did not simply explode. He prepared, he imagined, he watched, he stored details. He seemed to derive pleasure not only from the act itself, but from the approach to it, from the long tightening of control before the crime occurred. If you look at the city around him during those years, you see nothing that would easily account for that darkness. That is part of what makes the setting so important. The world around Dennis Rader was not some chaos-ridden underworld. It was a place of schedules, a place of neighbors borrowing tools, a place where church attendance still conferred a soft kind of trustworthiness, a place where family homes stood as symbols of order, privacy, and ordinary hope. He did not come from outside that system. He learned to wear it like clothing. And as Wichita moved through the decade, through seasons of snow, heat, school years, holiday dinners, summer lawns that needed cutting, and winter mornings when frost clung to parked cars, Rader was developing the habits of concealment that would eventually allow him to remain undetected for years. It is tempting, in retrospect, to treat him as if he were always visibly marked by his future crimes, as if someone should have looked closer and seen the truth staring back. But the more unsettling reality is that he was, for long stretches, entirely legible as an ordinary man. He held conversations. He went to work. He existed inside familiar institutions. That ordinary cover was not incidental. It was one of his greatest weapons. The Midwest in that era carried its own emotional weather, one shaped by restraint, modesty, and the assumption that what happened inside homes remained inside homes. People worked. People endured. People did not always narrate their private fears aloud. In a culture like that, someone like Dennis Rader could draw strength from the silence between appearances and reality. He was methodical. He liked structure. He was drawn to systems of authority. And that attraction would later appear not only in how he organized his life, but in how he imagined his victims. Control was not just something he wanted in isolated moments. It seemed to be the lens through which he organized emotion itself. That psychological background is essential to the atmosphere of this case. Because BTK did not simply want to kill, he wanted to orchestrate helplessness. He wanted to feel himself at the center of another person's narrowing options. He wanted, above all, to be the author of fear. Meanwhile, Wichita remained Wichita. Streets filled with station wagons, churches opened their doors. Teachers graded papers at kitchen tables. Children hurried into schools with cold hands and backpacks bumping against their coats. Family photographs were taken in living rooms with carefully arranged smiles. Most people do not think of themselves as characters in someone else's predatory imagination. They think in grocery lists, homework deadlines, utility bills, birthdays, arguments that will be forgotten by morning. That is one reason the BTK case feels so invasive. It reminds us that ordinary life can be observed from the outside by a person who does not see it as ordinary at all, but as available. Somewhere amid the routines of Wichita, Dennis Rader was learning how to move between two worlds without letting them collide. He was not a drifter with no fixed identity. He was embedded. He knew the social language of normality and used it fluently. He could stand in a church sanctuary under bright light and appear to many like a man with a place in the community. He could go home to family life. He could take part in the same civic textures that gave others reassurance. That doubleness would later shock the public, but it did not emerge overnight. It was built patiently, the way a person builds muscle through repetition. Every day that he remained unseen confirmed the usefulness of the disguise. The city itself played an unintended role in that concealment. Wichita was large enough to provide anonymity, but intimate enough that respectability still carried weight. People knew neighborhoods. They knew church affiliations. They noticed familiar cars. Yet even in a place with that social texture, the private chambers of a person's mind could remain sealed. The American suburban home, especially in the post-war imagination, represented more than shelter. It represented achievement, safety, family, self-rule. A front yard and a quiet street were not just physical surroundings. They were emotional promises. BTK would eventually violate that promise in ways that made the setting itself feel complicit in the terror. Not because the city invited him, but because its very order gave him cover. A man who looked like he belonged there was less likely to trigger alarm. A stranger at the edge of a property might draw suspicion. A familiar-seeming man could pass through attention like water through fingers. That is the cruel geometry of cases like this. The more a community trusts the shapes of ordinary life, the easier it can be for a predator to hide inside those shapes. Yet this part of the story is not only about Dennis Rader, it is also about the people who would one day become entangled in his private scripts without ever consenting to appear in them. Families in Wichita were building lives. They were planning meals, saving money, driving children to school, worrying about work, trying to hold marriages together, trying to get through the week. Some lived in neighborhoods where houses sat close enough that porch lights from one yard spilled into the next. Some left doors unlocked for short stretches because that had always seemed acceptable. Some trusted the ordinary rhythms of the city because those rhythms had earned that trust. There's a profound sadness in that, because innocence in a case like this is not just moral innocence. It is logistical innocence. It is the simple assumption that daily life will proceed according to the known script. BTK preyed on that assumption. He read it. He exploited it. And before any of the later notoriety, before the letters and the initials and the national fascination, the background of this story is simply a city going about its life while one man's hidden compulsions grew more elaborate in the dark. The late 60s and early 70s in America were also years of cultural shift and anxiety more broadly, but Wichita was not the kind of city that imagined itself at the symbolic center of that turbulence. It was steadier, quieter, less theatrical. That quietness became part of the shock. Serial murder was something many Americans associated with other places, other faces, other narratives. Not this street, not this church-going city, not this house with children's drawings on the refrigerator. Yet that is exactly why the BTK story would cut so deeply. It introduced the possibility that terror did not need an exotic setting. It could unfold under the same sky as Little League games and office Christmas parties. It could live behind a respectable front door. And at the center of it was a man whose emotional life seemed built around compartmentalization. Rader later described elements of his fantasy life with a disturbing matter-of-factness, as if discussing hobbies or personal habits. That emotional flatness, that ability to speak of cruelty without the moral weather most people would feel, reveals something fundamental about the background of the case. His inner world was not merely violent. It was arranged. It was filed. It was given categories and rituals. He collected not only fantasies but identities for himself, names and symbols that made him feel significant. The future BTK persona was already germinating in the background long before the public heard it. He wanted not just secrecy, but narrative. He wanted to become something in his own mind. a figure with a title, an authorial presence. That is why the case is as much about ego as it is about violence. The setting, then, is twofold. Externally, a modest American city with all the textures of ordinary life. Internally, a hidden theater of obsession taking shape inside one resident who had learned to function convincingly among others. Those two settings are about to collide, and when they do, the city will no longer feel entirely like itself. But in this background chapter, before the first major rupture, the most important thing to understand is how easy it was for everything to appear intact. Morning still came, children still left for school, churches still filled, husbands still went to work, wives still folded laundry and made shopping lists and answered the phone, somewhere behind one of those many ordinary doors. Dennis Rader was also living a domestic life. That fact sits at the core of the case like a shard of ice. He was not excluded from normalcy, he participated in it. He used it, he made normalcy itself part of his camouflage. And because camouflage is most effective when it resembles the background perfectly, Wichita became both setting and shield. The plains overhead, the open roads, the neighborhoods built on repetition and trust, the social value placed on order and modest presentation. All of it formed a world in which a disciplined predator could move without drawing immediate notice. He was not invisible because he lacked a body. He was invisible because he had learned the local grammar of appearing harmless. That is the background we need before the violence enters frame in full. Not just the biography of one man, but the emotional architecture of a city that believed in the reliability of its routines. BTK would later shatter that confidence, but first he had to grow inside it. He had to study it. He had to discover that the most frightening mask is often the most ordinary one. And so part 2 ends not with revelation, but with tension gathering behind the walls. Wichita is still breathing in its usual rhythms. Dennis Rader is still, to most eyes, only another man moving through the landscape. Yet beneath that plain exterior, the fantasies have already taken root. The split between his public self and private hunger is already widening. The machinery of concealment is already in motion. The city does not know it yet, but one of its own has begun turning ordinary life into raw material for terror. And that is what makes the background of BTK so difficult to absorb. There is no dramatic drumroll in the beginning. No theatrical warning that evil has entered the map. There is only accumulation. A fantasy repeated often enough to feel like destiny, a private appetite maturing behind a face that still blends into meetings, neighborhoods, and family photographs. A city trusting the ordinary choreography of its days while one resident studies vulnerability the way other men study manuals, roadmaps, or sermons. The weather changes. Summers bleach the grass, winters harden the ground. School years begin and end, children outgrow shoes. Paychecks are cashed, curtains are opened every morning and drawn every night. Life, from the outside, keeps moving with its familiar steadiness, but under that steady surface, something predatory is learning patience, something vain is learning that secrecy can be power. Something cold is discovering that control feels even stronger when it is exercised inside places built for comfort. That is the true setting of this story. Not simply Wichita on a map, but Wichita before innocence understood it had already been observed, measured, and marked by someone smiling in plain daylight all along. Before a city remembers initials, it remembers names, faces, kitchens, birthdays, school mornings, and the unfinished business of ordinary lives. That is where this part of the BTK story has to begin, because if we speak only about the killer's timing and methods, we accidentally let him define the frame. The victims of this case were not shadows waiting to enter his narrative. They were already living full lives before Dennis Rader ever crossed their paths. They belonged to families, neighborhoods, jobs, churches, routines, and hopes that had nothing to do with him. And one of the deepest cruelties in crimes like these is not only that life is taken, but that a human being with his own private obsessions tries to reduce other people into props in a story centered on himself. To resist that, we have to go back to the homes, the people, the textures of daily existence that existed before the fear came through the door. In January of 1974, the Otero family lived a life that, from the outside, would have been familiar to countless American families. Joseph Otero, known as Joe, had served in the Air Force and worked hard to provide for his household. He was a father, a husband, a man carrying the kind of responsibilities that often make a person seem older than his years. Julie Otero managed the home and the children. The thousand small moving parts that hold family life together, often invisibly. Their children, Joseph Jr., Josephine, and 9-year-old Charlie, were not symbols or case facts then. They were simply themselves. Children with voices, habits, moods, and the loose, unfinished energy of youth. Their home on North Edgemoor was the sort of place where the little rhythms of family living had already worn themselves into the walls. Breakfasts, school mornings, laundry, arguments over small things. The casual sounds of people who know where the cups are kept and which floorboard creaks first in the hallway. When tragedy later froze them in public memory, it did what public memory always does. It flattened. It turned living people into names spoken in one breath. But before that day, they were a family moving through winter like any other, carrying all the invisible momentum that ordinary life creates. Josephine, who was 11, lived at that age between childhood and early self-consciousness, old enough to begin forming a sharper sense of herself, young enough still to belong fully to the household world around her. Charlie was younger, still close to the soft center of family dependence. The age when adults tower over your understanding of the world and home still feels like the fixed axis around which everything turns. Joe and Julie were not just two adults in a tragic headline. They were parents inside the long, repetitive labor of family life. The kind of labor rarely described in police records because police arrive only after life has already been interrupted. Somewhere in that house were dishes that needed washing, clothes that needed folding, errands not yet run, worries about money or schedules or health that were completely ordinary and therefore precious in retrospect. That is the terrible thing about looking back. The mundane begins to glow. Across the years that followed, BTK would leave 10 victims in his wake, and every one of them had that same private abundance of life before he arrived. Catherine Bright was 21 when she was killed in 1974, and there is something especially painful about youth interrupted at that stage. Because a person is still in the process of becoming. She had family, connections, habits, plans, a future that still had room to move in multiple directions. Her brother Kevin survived the attack that took her life, and even that detail reveals something essential about the human cost of this case. BTK did not only leave death, he left witnesses, survivors, siblings, parents, children, and spouses who had to continue living inside the aftermath. Catherine was not merely one point on a timeline. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman with a voice that once filled rooms in ways no summary can capture. Shirley Vian, murdered in 1977, was a mother of 3. That single fact should stop us. A mother of 3. It is easy to read quickly past such words because true crime has trained audiences to move from name to method to suspect with unnatural speed. But if we slow down, that phrase opens into an entire world. 3 children who knew the sound of her footsteps. 3 children who would have measured safety partly by her presence, a household shaped around her care, her labor, her attention, her fatigue. When someone like Shirley is taken, the loss is not abstract. It tears through the practical fabric of a family. It changes mornings, mealtimes, school pickups, the emotional climate of a home. It leaves children trying to understand why the person who organized so much of their reality is suddenly gone. Nancy Fox, killed in 1977 as well, was 25 years old and worked as a jewelry salesperson. She lived alone, which in another context might simply describe a stage of adulthood. A life of work, privacy, and independence, but within the BTK case, that detail became part of the vulnerability he exploited. Still, it must not be read backward as inevitability. Nancy was living her life. Not auditioning for victimhood, she was building days out of work and rest and the small self-directed freedoms that come with adulthood. She had friends, co-workers, a home arranged according to her own preferences, perhaps favorite rooms, favorite habits, favorite songs on the radio after a long day. The violence that ended her life did not define her, it interrupted her. Maureen Hedge, murdered in 1985, had reached middle age. By then, a person has gathered not only experiences but a certain accumulated selfhood. A pattern of relationships and memories that becomes harder to summarize because life has become more layered. She worked. She lived. She knew people. She occupied a fully adult world of obligations in familiar places. Vicky Wigirl, killed in 1986, was a wife and mother. Part of another domestic universe with its own pulse, its own tenderness, its own assumptions about the safety of home. Dolores Davis, murdered in 1991, was 62 years old. And her age reminds us that BTK's victims do not fit neatly into one simple category beyond vulnerability to his fantasies of control. Dolores had lived decades before he ever noticed her. Decades of relationships, work, private joys, disappointments, habits, griefs, seasonal memories, and personal history. To reduce such a life to the circumstances of its ending is to repeat, in a softer form, the same theft the killer committed. So the victim's story in this case is not one story. It is many lives, brutally intersected by one man's obsession. And yet there are themes that connect them. One is domesticity. Again and again, BTK targeted people in or around the spaces where they should have been safest. Another is trust in ordinary time. These were not people walking into some obviously marked danger. They were inside daily life, at home, with children, between errands. In the ordinary hours, when people tend to believe the world will continue behaving like itself, there is a special cruelty in that, because ordinary time is where human beings let their guard down enough to be themselves. A mother in her own home is not performing for the world. A child in the living room is not imagining violence entering the scene. A woman returning from work, taking off her shoes, settling into evening, is inhabiting the private version of self that only home permits. BTK invaded that softness. He used people's ordinary humanity against them. The Otero family embodies that violation most completely because they were a family unit, together under one roof. Each person nested inside the other's lives. It is difficult even now to think about that household without feeling the scale of what was destroyed in a single morning. Joe and Julie were not only parents in the general sense, they were the center of specific children's worlds. They knew what foods their children liked, which child needed correction in one tone and comfort in another, which mornings would be hurried, which evenings would run late, how to read the atmosphere of their own home at a glance. Those forms of knowledge vanish almost completely from the public record after a crime. Investigators document times, positions, evidence, injuries, sequence, necessary things. But the emotional architecture of a family is much harder to preserve. What did the house smell like on a school morning? Which room did Josephine linger in? Did Charlie leave toys in places adults had to step around? What private jokes existed in that family and disappeared with them? The absence of those details is part of the tragedy. A crime scene file records death. It cannot adequately hold life. The same is true of the later victims. When people speak of Catherine Bright, we should remember not only the attack, but the fact that she lived in a relationship, that she was loved by a brother who survived and by others who had to keep carrying her memory after public attention moved on. When people speak of Shirley Vian, they should picture not merely a case photograph or an investigative timeline, but a mother whose children once expected her to be there tomorrow. When people speak of Nancy Fox, they should picture a young woman with the dignity of an ordinary adult life, not just the terrible way that life was invaded. When people speak of Vicki Wegerle and Dolores Davis, they should imagine not only the final violence, but the years before it. The homes they arranged, the people who counted on them, the patterns of care that made up their days. Respect for victims is not achieved merely by lowering the voice or avoiding sensational language. It requires a more demanding act. It requires imagination disciplined by humility. It asks us to remember that every victim had an interior world richer than anything the case record can show. Dennis Rader tried to convert those lives into episodes in his own mythology. He gave himself initials. He wrote letters. He tried to build a persona large enough to overshadow the people he hurt. The victim's story pushes back against that. It says that before there was BTK, there were families. Before there was fear spread across Wichita, there were kitchens warmed by routine. Children moving through school years, women navigating work and home. Adults carrying the normal burdens of life without the slightest reason to imagine they had entered the orbit of a predator. It is also important to understand how the victims were chosen not because they lacked value or awareness, but because Rader was patient enough to look for openings. He watched. He studied. He noticed who was home, who was alone, which houses offered privacy, which routines seemed readable. That means the victim's story is also a story about how vulnerability is created by circumstance, not by weakness. A child is vulnerable because children trust. A parent is vulnerable because caring for others consumes attention. A woman living alone is vulnerable because privacy, which should be a freedom, can be turned by a predator into isolation. An older adult is vulnerable because the body and household rhythm of later life come with assumptions of peace that should never be punished. BTK exploited these realities. He did not reveal anything deficient in his victims. He revealed something predatory in himself. Even in the surviving family members and witnesses, the victim's story continues. Kevin Bright did not simply survive an attack. He lived on in the shadow of it, carrying memory and injury and the unbearable responsibility of existing after someone you love has been taken in front of you. Children who lost parents had to grow up with a hole in the center of their lives. Spouses had to keep breathing through houses that no longer felt like homes. Parents of murdered adult children faced the impossible reversal of outliving someone they raised. Every victim stands at the center of widening circles of grief, and that widening is part of the story as much as any forensic clue. So when we enter the next chapter of this case, when violence steps fully into frame, it matters that we carry these people with us as people, not statistics, not archetypes, not the supporting cast in the biography of a killer. Joe Otero, a father and husband. Julie Otero, a mother holding a household together. Josephine and Charlie, children whose lives should have stretched far beyond a single winter morning. Catherine Bright, a young woman with a future still unfolding. Shirley Vian, whose children should have had more years of their mother's presence. Nancy Fox, living an ordinary life of work and independence. Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerle. Dolores Davis, each with a history larger than the final chapter forced upon them. This is the victim's story of BTK, a story of interrupted lives, but first and more importantly of lived ones, a story that begins not in terror, but in the soft daily glow of family photographs, front doors opening and closing, school mornings, dishes in the sink, errands left unfinished, voices that once answered when called from another room. If we listen closely enough, that lost ordinary world is still there beneath the case file, beneath the headlines, beneath the killer's self-invented initials. And it deserves to be heard before anything else. There is another reason to linger here before moving on. True crime can create a dangerous illusion that victims begin at the moment they are harmed, as if their lives only become narratively visible once violence enters. But real life works in the opposite direction. Meaning accumulates before disaster. Not after it. Every family meal. Every ride to school. Every ordinary Tuesday. Every plan for next week deepens what is later lost. In the BTK case, that accumulated meaning is what makes the silence afterward feel so heavy. An empty chair is never just a chair. It is a shape memory. A child's room is never just a room. It is a world interrupted mid-sentence. A kitchen after sudden loss still contains cups. Magnets, unpaid bills. Groceries, all the evidence that someone expected life to continue. And that, perhaps, is the final truth of the victim's story. They were not living in a tragedy while they were alive. They were living in time, expecting tomorrow. Carrying routines forward with the faith most people need in order to function at all. Dennis Rader shattered that faith for many families. But he did not erase the fullness that existed before he arrived. Our responsibility is to keep that fullness visible. To hold on to the human scale of these lives, even as the darkness of the case gathers around them. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, winter sat over Wichita with the flat, colorless patience that Midwestern mornings can carry, the kind of cold that seems less dramatic than inevitable. The neighborhood around the Otero home did not wake to anything that would have warned it of what was already in motion. Houses stood in their quiet rows under a pale sky. Driveways held parked cars with a faint crust of frost. Somewhere a heater clicked on behind walls. Somewhere a radio began murmuring the day's news to a kitchen not yet fully warm. Children in nearby homes were thinking about school, about lunch money, about whether they had forgotten homework. Adults were stepping into the usual machinery of the morning, brushing teeth, buttoning coats, glancing at clocks. In a place built on repetition and routine, there was nothing visible in the air to suggest that one family was about to be torn apart in a way that would haunt the city for decades. Inside the Otero home, life had begun like any other weekday. Joe Otero was there. Julie Otero was there. Their children were there. It was a house filled with the ordinary evidence of family existence. The kind of evidence people stop seeing because it is always around them. Clothes, dishes, furniture arranged not for display but for use. The private clutter and warmth of a real household. That reality is important because what happened next did not occur in some abstract setting called a crime scene. It happened inside a family home, inside a place shaped by breakfasts, school mornings, and small domestic habits. When Dennis Rader entered that house, he did not cross into an empty stage. He crossed into the center of other people's lives. He had come prepared. This was not improvisation. He had watched. He had fantasized. He had selected. In his mind, the event had already taken shape before he ever stepped through the door. Later, the details would reveal planning, calculation, and a cold determination to control every moving part of the encounter. But in the actual moment, what the family faced was not some cinematic figure announcing himself as evil. It was a man bringing force and intrusion into the middle of an ordinary morning, a stranger imposing his private script on people who had every reason to believe they were still inside the safety of home. Accounts differ in certain small retellings over the years, but the broad truth is brutally clear. Rader entered the Otero residence armed, carrying with him the intention to subdue the family. He used deception and threats to establish control. The first violence in a home invasion is often not physical but psychological. It is the instant the room changes shape, the instant voices sharpen, the instant a parent understands that an unknown man in the house is not merely a trespasser but a danger moving toward the children. It is in that instant that ordinary time breaks. Everything that belonged to morning a few seconds earlier, the expected sequence of getting dressed, eating, leaving, returning later, is suddenly gone. In its place comes a compressed, terrible present in which every breath matters and every decision is made under fear. Joe and Julie Otero were forced into that present while their children were there beside them, and that fact alone gives the crime its deepest cruelty. Parents can endure enormous fear for themselves. What strips the soul bare is fear for a child. In those first minutes, Joe and Julie were not characters in a future headline. They were a mother and father trying to comprehend danger fast enough to protect the people they loved. Rader controlled the room with weapons and commands, moving the family into the positions he wanted, using intimidation to strip them of options. In crimes like this, the killer's greatest weapon is often not the object in his hand, but the certainty he creates in everyone else that resistance may make things worse. He feeds on hesitation, on the natural human instinct to comply when a loved one might be spared. You can imagine the atmosphere in that house tightening second by second, the sounds becoming unnaturally distinct. The scrape of movement against carpet, the tremor in a voice trying to stay calm. The faint household noises that continue absurdly in the background, a heater running, a floorboard responding to wait, a dog somewhere outside. Life in the neighborhood still moving on while terror gathers inside one address. That is one of the most unbearable aspects of home invasion violence. The ordinary world does not stop. It continues just beyond the walls. Unaware, Rader bound members of the family. That act alone tells us everything about the kind of control he sought. Binding is not merely restraint. It is ritualized domination. It turns people from acting human beings into bodies someone else is attempting to arrange. For Rader, this was central. He was not only interested in killing, he was interested in creating helplessness. He wanted the room to reflect his will. He wanted fear to sit in every corner. Joe Otero, who had the physical presence and instinct of a father trying to protect his family, was forced into a position where his ability to do that was taken from him piece by piece. Julie Otero, facing danger not only to herself but to her children, had to endure the specific agony of maternal helplessness. The knowledge that terror was now moving through the very place that should have shielded them all. Josephine and Charlie were children inside a world that had turned unrecognizable in a matter of minutes. No child has language for that transition. One moment there are familiar walls, familiar furniture, familiar adults. The next there is command, fear, a stranger's presence, and the dawning realization that the rules of the world have changed without warning. The violence that followed inside the Otero home was methodical. It was not a blur of rage burning itself out. It was a sequence of actions carried out by a man determined to maintain control as the scene unfolded. That is part of what makes this incident so central to understanding BTK. His crimes were not only assaults on life, they were ceremonies of domination staged inside intimate space. He would later speak of fantasies, of projects, of targets, in language so chillingly detached that it reveals how thoroughly he had separated his own desires from the humanity of his victims. In the Otero home, that separation became catastrophic reality. One by one, the members of the family were overpowered. One by one, the house that held their ordinary life was turned into a chamber of terror. And because this was the first major crime publicly associated with what would later become BTK, the city had not yet learned the pattern. There was no wider mythology then, no nickname, no initials, no grim expectation. There was only the raw event itself, a family annihilated in the course of a morning by a man who had arrived as an intrusion and stayed as a force of deliberate destruction. What is difficult to convey without crossing into spectacle is the emotional violence embedded in the sequence. Joe and Julie were present not only for their own danger, but for the danger facing their children. The children were present in the atmosphere of adult fear, forced to register distress they could not possibly process. There is a kind of cruelty in such crimes that exceeds physical harm because it turns love itself into another instrument of torment. A parent complies because a child is threatened. A child looks toward a parent for reassurance that no longer exists. The household bonds that usually protect and comfort become, under coercion, channels through which fear passes even faster. Rader understood that, whether consciously in every moment or simply through predatory instinct, he knew how to use family structure against itself. He entered a home built around care and made care unbearable. When the violence was over, the silence left behind must have been almost impossible to comprehend. Homes are not made to hold aftermath like that. They are built to contain the soft sounds of living. Conversation from another room, movement in hallways, a child being called to breakfast, a chair dragged back from the table. After sudden violence, those same rooms become alien. Furniture remains where it was, objects remain. But the meaning of space changes instantly. The home becomes divided into before and after. In the case of the Oteros, that transformation happened in a single morning. It is worth pausing on the killer's emotional weather during the incident, because it illuminates the pathology that would later define the case. Rader was not a man losing control. He was a man seeking it. The house did not become chaotic because he was out of command. It became horrific because command was exactly what he wanted. That difference matters. A crime of uncontrolled rage can be terrifying. But a crime of deliberate control carries another layer of dread. It means the suffering is not incidental to the offender's purpose. It is part of the architecture in the Otero home. Control was the point. The family was forced into his design. And the design itself was fueled by fantasy long before the day arrived. By the time he stood inside that house, he was not discovering what he wanted. He was enacting it. Somewhere outside, Wichita remained unaware for a little longer. Streets continued their weekday rhythm. School schedules moved forward. Clocks changed minute by minute as if the day were still normal. Yet inside one house, time had been broken. That image matters because the incident was not only the murder of individuals, it was the tearing open of ordinary time for the Otero family. Morning never reached afternoon. Routine never became memory in the normal way. It became evidence. The room-by-room intimacy of domestic life was overwritten by fear so completely that even later descriptions of the home would struggle to restore it as a place where people had recently laughed, slept, worried over bills, and prepared for school. That is how total the intrusion was. Rader did not just bring violence into the house. He took the emotional identity of the house and replaced it with terror. The children's presence makes this first crime especially devastating in historical memory, because the public can process many kinds of violence more easily than violence that reaches directly into family innocence. Josephine and Charlie were not in some peripheral relation to the event. They were inside it, caught in the center of adult evil before they had any defense against the idea that such evil existed. Every account of the case carries that weight. Even when the details are stripped down, it is the knowledge that childhood itself was cornered inside the home and forced to encounter something designed to dominate and destroy. Joe and Julie, in turn, were forced to experience the ultimate parental nightmare, the collapse of their ability to protect. That emotional structure, more than any single forensic fact, is why the incident has endured with such force. The Otero murders were not just deadly. They were intimate in the worst possible way. In later years, Dennis Rader would construct a persona around his crimes, but there was no mythic distance here in the beginning. There was only a man in a family's home, using threats, restraints, and methodical violence to impose his will on people whose lives he had chosen to invade. The BTK identity would come later, packaged in letters and ego and the hunger for recognition. At the start, there was simply this incident. A winter morning, a family caught off guard, and a predator crossing the threshold between fantasy and action. Afterward, the house stood as houses always do, still and mute, offering no way to reverse what had happened inside it. Walls do not reject memory. They hold it. Every room of that home had been a witness. And soon others would enter, trying to reconstruct sequence from silence, trying to read violence from its traces. But in the incident itself, before discovery, before the police tape, before the public fear, there was that terrible concentrated period when the Oteros were alone with the man who had decided their home would become the first full expression of his hidden compulsions. He arrived with intent. He created fear. He bound, controlled, and killed. And in doing so, He opened the dark chapter that Wichita would spend years trying to understand. The city did not know it yet. But this was not merely one shocking crime. It was the first visible tear in the fabric. The moment an invisible predator stopped imagining and started acting, leaving behind not just death but a new kind of fear. The fear that evil could step into an ordinary house on an ordinary morning and rearrange everything forever. And even within that first incident, you can already see the traits that would define the crimes to come. The waiting beforehand. The confidence that he could move from fantasy into action and then back again into ordinary life. The need to make the victim's home serve his internal script. He was not driven only by the desire to end life. He was driven by the desire to choreograph the ending. To decide who would sit, who would speak, who would plead, who would be forced to watch fear move across the faces of the people they loved. That is why the incident feels larger than one house. It is the first moment in which Dennis Rader turned private obsession into lived reality and discovered that he could survive the crossing. After the Otero murders, he did not collapse under guilt or panic and surrender himself. He returned to the city that still did not know his face. That return is part of the horror too. Somewhere after leaving that house, the same streets continued beneath his feet. The winter air touched his skin. He could pass through public space carrying what he had just done. And nothing in the visible world rose up to mark him. That silence from the world, that terrible normalcy, would teach him something he should never have learned. That he could do this and remain hidden. And once a predator learns that lesson, the danger deepens. The incident at the Otero home was therefore not only an atrocity, it was an initiation, a proof of concept. A point of no return. The man who crossed that threshold did not merely commit murder. He confirmed for himself that ordinary neighborhoods could be penetrated, that family life could be overpowered, and that fear could be manufactured and left behind like poison in the walls. From that morning onward, Wichita contained a man who knew what he was capable of and knew, dangerously, that he had gotten away with it. The first people to encounter a crime scene are often not yet standing inside a story. They are standing inside confusion. They do not know what history will later call the moment. They know only that something is wrong, then terribly wrong. Then beyond anything the mind can comfortably arrange. That is how the discovery at the Otero home entered the world. Not as a legend, not as a solved chapter in the life of a famous serial killer, but as a shock that had to be understood in fragments. A missed call, a house too quiet, a child not where he should be, a growing unease turning practical adults into witnesses before they are ready to accept what they are seeing. By the time police arrived at the home on North Edgemore on January 15th, 1974, the warmth of ordinary family life had already been replaced by the heavy stillness that settles after violence. But that stillness did not explain itself. It had to be read. Room by room, body by body, object by object. This is the terrible discipline of the first investigation. The dead do not tell the story in order. They leave it broken across a house and ask strangers to piece it together. The Otero home, like so many homes after sudden violence, still looked in many ways like a real home. Furniture remained. Household items remained. Nothing about a family dwelling instantly transforms into theatrical horror just because evil has passed through it. That contrast can be deeply disorienting for first responders. A lamp still stands where a lamp belongs. A table remains a table. Curtains hang in the same windows that had filtered winter light only hours earlier. Yet inside that familiar domestic frame, death has entered with such force that every ordinary object begins to seem altered. The air itself changes. People who have worked crime scenes often speak of atmosphere not as superstition, but as accumulated sensory fact. The wrong kind of silence, the wrong kind of stillness. The sense that the house has stopped behaving like a house and become instead a container of interruption. For the Otero home, the discovery appears to have begun when Joseph Otero Jr., who had not been home during the killings, returned and realized something was terribly wrong. There is a specific cruelty in that detail. One child survived because he happened to be away, and so the first bridge between the dead house and the outside world was carried through the shock of a son and brother who came back expecting family and found absence. Even before authorities take over, scenes like this are often shaped by a civilian's first stunned interpretation. A door, a room. A glance that does not make sense at first, then the recognition that what is lying ahead is not illness, not accident, not sleep, but something deliberate and irreversible. When officers reached the house, they were entering not just a site of multiple homicide, but a family's ruined center. The discovery of 4 members of the household inside immediately signaled that this was no ordinary domestic dispute gone wrong. No isolated blow struck in panic. There was a structure to what had happened. A sequence and degree of control that announced itself even before the full picture emerged. Investigators would have seen signs of binding, signs of struggle or attempted resistance, signs that the killer had not simply rushed in and fled. The arrangement of the scene suggested time spent inside the home. That matters. A killer who remains long enough to subdue multiple victims, move among rooms, and carry out a sequence of acts is revealing confidence, planning, and a terrifying willingness to occupy intimate space while normal life outside continues. In the Otero home, the first clues were not glamorous clues. Real investigations rarely begin with a single brilliant detail glowing in plain sight. They begin with the body's position, the condition of clothing, the state of doors and windows, the presence or absence of forced entry, the household items out of place, the timing implied by school schedules and neighborhood observations. They begin with tiny contradictions between how a home should look and how it now does. In this case, one of the earliest and most chilling clues was the evidence of restraint itself. Bindings told police that the killer sought control before death. This was not a spontaneous burst of violence followed by retreat. It was a staged domination of the household. That single fact would become deeply important later because it hinted at psychology long before investigators had a name. Restraint means preparation. It means intent to overpower rather than merely injure. It means the offender derived something from helplessness. It also means that the killer had brought part of his script with him. Other clues would have emerged in layers: the status of the telephone, the order in which victims were likely attacked, whether valuables were missing or left behind, whether drawers had been disturbed in a way that suggested real searching or merely superficial disarray. In many murders, investigators ask first whether the motive looks like robbery, jealousy, family rage, sexual violence, or some hybrid of these. At the Otero scene, the answer would not have arrived cleanly. The home invasion aspect could suggest one thing, the restraints another, the multiple victims another still. That uncertainty is one reason early investigations move carefully around a scene, because the first impression can mislead. A room can look ransacked when in fact the disorder came from panic. A missing item can look like motive when it is merely afterthought. Yet even at this earliest stage, the Otero murders carried the stamp of something colder and stranger than a typical burglary. The killer had not behaved like someone focused on speed or loot. He had behaved like someone trying to impose a design. And that design left clues not only in physical traces, but in the emotional logic of the room. Detectives and crime scene personnel would have noted the family relationship among the victims, the age differences, and the terrifying implication that the killer had been willing to control parents and children together under one roof. That level of domination narrows the emotional profile of a suspect. It suggests someone comfortable with terror, someone able to continue while confronted by pleading, confusion, and the living presence of multiple victims. It points toward a predator who is not overwhelmed by the humanity of the people in front of him, but energized by their vulnerability. Of course, in the first hours, police do not yet speak in those fully formed terms. They process, photograph, preserve, document. They keep people back. They mark positions. They begin asking who last saw the family alive, who knew their routines, whether anyone noticed an unfamiliar car, whether there had been prior threats, whether Joe Otero had enemies through work or military service, whether any relative had reason to harm the household. The opening stage of a homicide investigation is often a wide circle, because certainty too early can ruin the truth. So around the Otero scene, there would have been not only grief, but procedural motion. Patrol officers outside, detectives inside, neighbors gathering at distances that felt both respectful and hungry, radios crackling, questions multiplying faster than answers. One of the haunting things about discovery scenes in neighborhood murders is how quickly the private and public collide. A family's worst moment becomes visible to strangers through police presence alone. Curtains twitch, front porches fill, children are called indoors. People speak in lowered voices, trying to assemble an explanation before one exists. The Otero house would have become, almost immediately, more than a home. It became the center of local dread, though not yet in the fully mythic way it later would. At this point, it was simply a place where something unthinkable had happened to a whole family at once. The initial clues at the scene also mattered because they did not point clearly to the easiest explanation. If a husband kills his family, investigators often find certain domestic indicators. If a burglar kills during interruption, the scene may reflect haste, theft, and opportunistic violence. But here the bindings and methodical control suggested a more unusual offender. There may have been limited forensic evidence by later standards. This was 1974. And investigative science had not yet gained the tools that modern audiences now take for granted. No instant DNA miracle was waiting in the wings. Detectives depended heavily on physical observation, witness accounts, timelines, trace evidence, and behavioral inference. Every fiber, every print, every footprint, every ligature became important precisely because the scene itself was speaking in a language investigators had to learn quickly. One especially chilling dimension of the discovery was the realization that one child had survived by sheer circumstance. Joseph Jr. His absence from the home at the time of the murders meant that the scene carried not only death, but a living continuation of the family line. Someone who would now stand outside the house and know that everyone inside had been taken. That emotional reality changes the air around an investigation. Officers are no longer just managing a homicide site. They are also managing immediate family trauma at the rawest possible stage, where questions from the living stab into the process before anyone has enough facts to answer them. The house, meanwhile, continued to yield its silent testimony. Investigators would have considered entry and exit points carefully. Was there forced entry? Or had the family opened the door? Were there signs that the killer had watched the home and chosen a moment deliberately? Did the sequence of the scene suggest a lone offender or more than one? These questions matter because multiple victims naturally raise the possibility of multiple assailants. Yet the control evident at the scene may also have suggested that one determined, armed offender could have done this if he established fear quickly enough. That ambiguity would have complicated the first investigative hours. In the public imagination, discoveries often appear as instant revelations. In reality, the first clue is often not a revelation, but a pressure, something that rules out easy stories. Something that widens the mystery rather than solving it. For the Otero murders, the bindings, the family setting, and the apparent control exerted over the household all widened the mystery. They suggested a killer who had not merely arrived but had planned. A killer with patience, a killer willing to remain present in the emotional center of a family's suffering. Those are terrifying clues, because they point not toward an accident of circumstance, but toward a mind already shaped for predation. It is also likely that the lack of obvious theft as a primary goal began steering detectives away from ordinary property crime as the main explanation. If money and valuables were not the central focus, then what was? Control. Sexual compulsion, personal grievance. The early crime scene could not yet answer that cleanly, but it could whisper it. It could tell investigators that the household had not been treated like inventory. It had been treated like theater. That distinction, though perhaps only dimly perceived at first, would later become essential to understanding BTK. The discovery phase of this case therefore sits at a strange crossroads between horror and incompleteness. Police and family members knew enough to understand the scale of the atrocity, but not enough yet to name the pattern or the man behind it. The scene was rich with clues and poor with explanation. It contained method, but not motive, sequence, but not identity. Every multiple homicide scene asks investigators to read both what happened and what kind of person would do such a thing. At the Otero home, the answer to the second question was already lurking in the first: a person who binds, a person who controls, a person who can move through a family house in daylight and continue, a person who leaves not only bodies but a violated atmosphere behind. The house itself, once a place of routine and trust, now held the first hard outline of the offender's psychology. Long before the letters, long before the initials, the scene was already saying what kind of darkness had crossed the threshold, yet early investigators still had to work inside uncertainty. They had to collect what could be collected, guard what could be guarded, and resist the urge to declare understanding before they had earned it. In that sense, the initial clues were both valuable and cruel. Valuable because they revealed deliberation. Cruel because they revealed just enough deliberation to make the city afraid. A methodical killer is far more frightening than an impulsive one, especially when no suspect is in hand. As word spread, the discovery at the Otero home became larger than the house. It entered neighborhood talk, police strategy, family grief, local fear, but at its center remained the same silent evidence: the bindings, the positions, the ordinary rooms made unbearable by what they contained. This was the beginning of a case in which clues would speak long before the killer chose to speak for himself. And what they said first was simple, chilling, and incomplete. Someone had come into that family's home with a plan. Someone had stayed long enough to carry it out. Someone had left behind not random destruction, but a pattern of control. The city did not know his face yet, but in the stillness of that first crime scene, the outline of his hunger was already there. After the Otero murders, Wichita police were not dealing with a mystery that felt clean enough to sit inside any single familiar category. If the killings had been the result of a private family rage, the shape of the scene did not comfortably support that. If they had been a burglary interrupted, the degree of control and the methodical handling of multiple victims seemed too deliberate, too intimate, too prolonged. The investigation therefore began inside a dangerous kind of uncertainty. The kind that forces detectives to widen their net while the public, the press, and the families of the dead all hunger for a faster answer than evidence can honestly provide. In homicide work, the first days are a contest between urgency and distortion. Every hour matters, but every assumption can poison the trail. Wichita investigators had to move through that tension while standing at the edge of one of the most disturbing crime scenes the city had ever seen. The immediate task was broad and relentless. Detectives had to reconstruct the final hours of the Otero family. Identify anyone who might have known their schedule. Ask whether Joe Otero had business or personal conflicts. Examine the possibility of military acquaintances or former grudges, and look hard at anyone who had reason to enter the house or knowledge of who might be home that morning. Neighbors had to be interviewed. Vehicles had to be remembered. Small, uncertain observations had to be collected before memory began to degrade under rumor and fear. Every investigation like this begins with a flood of names, possibilities, and half-formed theories. Someone saw a man walking. Someone noticed an unfamiliar car. Someone remembers a dog barking at the wrong hour. Someone says the family was quiet, religious, decent, unlikely to attract enemies. Such facts can help, mislead, or do both at once. Detectives working those first leads often do not yet know which details will matter later. So they gather everything, carrying the burden of sorting signal from noise while the city around them starts to tremble. The Otero case presented another immediate problem. 4 victims in one home generate a psychological pressure unlike that of a single homicide. A family annihilation demands explanation, and because the human mind hates a vacuum, theories rush in to fill it. Some lean inward, toward family or acquaintance. Others lean outward, toward a prowler, a burglar, an unseen intruder. Detectives had to consider all of them. It is easy in hindsight, once BTK has a face and a name, to imagine the investigation marching steadily toward him, but that is not how real investigations feel from the inside. They feel crowded, exhausting, and often humiliatingly blind. You chase what is available, not what history will later reveal as important. The offender, meanwhile, enjoys the advantage of knowing the truth from the beginning. In the weeks after the murders, police worked the case as thoroughly as the tools of the era allowed. Forensic science in 1974 could preserve and compare prints, fibers, shoe impressions, ligatures, and trace material, but it lacked the DNA technologies that later generations would imagine as automatic. This meant detective work remained deeply dependent on interviews, timelines, physical scene interpretation, and the patient elimination of possibilities. The Otero crime scene may have yielded fragments, but fragments do not become a face without context. A print matters only if it can be matched. A fiber matters only if it leads somewhere. A witness matters only if memory is stable enough to survive fear, suggestion, and time. Wichita investigators were trying to build a suspect from absence. And absence is stubborn material. The first dead ends arrived not because detectives were careless, but because the case offered too many plausible doors and too few clear handles. If there had been a personal motive, it refused to show itself cleanly. If there had been theft, it did not explain the method. If there had been sexual compulsion, it had not yet announced its full pattern to the police in a way that could be easily named. Serial crime, especially in its early stage, is difficult partly because investigators do not know they are seeing a series until another event confirms the first. Before pattern, every crime appears to be itself alone. That isolation can blind a department. They were hunting not yet a famous predator, but an unknown offender who had committed one appalling multiple homicide and then vanished back into ordinary life. And ordinary life was his greatest shield. Dennis Rader was not hiding in a ditch or fleeing state lines in panic. He was blending. He was returning to the same city the police were trying to search. That is what makes the investigative phase of BTK so unnerving. The offender was not only unknown, he was socially legible as normal. While detectives pushed outward through neighborhoods and statements, he was moving inward through routine, going to work, speaking to people, continuing the performance of harmlessness. The gap between those two realities widened the frustration of the case. Then came another rupture. In April 1974, Catherine Bright was attacked in her home, and her brother Kevin survived. Suddenly, the first terrible question rose with more force. Was Wichita looking at a repeat offender? The Bright case sharpened investigative attention in crucial ways. Here again was a home invasion. Here again was a victim selected in an intimate space. Here again was evidence of a man willing to remain close enough to overpower and terrorize rather than simply strike and flee. Kevin Bright's survival mattered immensely because survivors can supply what crime scenes cannot. The shape of a voice, the speed of movement, the physicality of the offender, the feel of his presence in a room. Yet even survivor testimony, precious as it is, has limits. Trauma scrambles time. Fear magnifies certain details and erases others. A victim may remember the weapon vividly, but not the jawline, the breathing, but not the exact height, the rhythm of speech, but not the face. Investigators had more now than they had after the Otero murders, but not enough to leap cleanly to identification. They were beginning to see pattern without yet possessing precision. That is one of the cruelest stages in a serial investigation. The pieces start resembling one another, which confirms danger. But resemblance alone does not hand you the man. The Bright case pushed the police toward a broader theory of an offender driven by control and proximity. someone stalking or selecting victims rather than killing by impulse. It also intensified fear across the city. As public fear grows, investigations become harder in some ways. Tips increase, but so do false leads. Men get reported for looking odd. Cars become suspicious merely by being unfamiliar. Old grudges get repackaged as certainty. The police are flooded with possibilities. And each one costs time to verify. Investigators in Wichita were now in exactly that storm, trying to stay disciplined while the city's imagination surged ahead of the evidence. Then in 1974, the killer made his presence felt in another way. He sent a message, a letter hidden inside a library book, describing the Otero murders and taking responsibility. That changed the investigation profoundly. Until then, detectives were reading the killer from scenes. Now the killer was trying to write himself into the case. His communication revealed vanity, detachment, and a need for recognition. It also revealed the beginning of what would become one of the most defining features of BTK. He did not merely want to commit crimes, he wanted authorship over them. For investigators, the letter was both a gift and an insult. A gift because offenders who communicate expose psychology, language patterns, and sometimes practical clues. An insult because the act of communication is also a bid for dominance. He was not begging to be caught. He was shaping the conversation. He was telling police and press that he existed, that he had a chosen identity, that he wanted fear to travel under his direction. In later communications, he would call himself BTK for bind, torture, kill, compressing his method into a label that sounds almost bureaucratic in its coldness. From an investigative standpoint, the nickname helped define the offender's psychology even as it expanded his myth. Here was a man who conceptualized his crimes, who thought in titles, who wanted the city to know it was being watched by an intelligence rather than battered by random chaos. But knowing that much still did not tell detectives where he slept, where he worked, what face he carried through daylight. This was the central dead end of the BTK investigation for years. The police increasingly understood the kind of offender they were dealing with, yet still could not convert that understanding into an arrest. They had profile without identity, pattern without location, menace without a name. The cases that followed only deepened the frustration. Shirley Vian in 1977. Nancy Fox later the same year, a city now forced to accept that one offender was indeed moving among them, selecting victims, entering private spaces, killing, and then returning to the anonymous bloodstream of ordinary civic life. Each new crime expanded the file, but expansion is not the same as clarity. Detectives could compare methods, victimology, geographic choices, timing, possible pre-attack surveillance, and the killer's communications. They could study his need for control, his tendency toward binding, his comfort with intimate settings, his interest in psychologically dominating victims. They could begin to understand that he was likely organized, likely familiar with the city, likely capable of maintaining a socially functional exterior, yet thousands of men might fit parts of that description. Investigators were not searching a tiny category, they were searching a city. And as years went on, the lack of resolution became its own form of damage. Cold cases do not merely sleep, they erode morale. Detectives retire, files grow heavy, leads lose heat, witnesses move, die, forget, or become tired of revisiting old fear. Institutional memory thins. What once lived in the body of one detective as instinct becomes, over time, paper in a box, vulnerable to being read without the urgency that originally shaped it. The BTK investigation suffered from this long attrition. There were suspects. Of course, men were considered, examined, and ruled out. Names rose and fell. Some seemed promising because they lived near a crime scene, some because of criminal histories, some because of odd behavior, some because they vaguely resembled witness descriptions. But vague resemblance is a swamp. Without the right corroboration, detectives can spend months circling a man who feels wrong in the gut yet cannot be tied to the case. Meanwhile, the real offender stays outside the frame, protected by his own discipline and by the limitations of the evidence. Rader's ordinary-seeming life was a devastating advantage. He had a job. He had a family. He could appear respectable. Even dull. There are offenders whose pathology leaks into daily life in obvious ways. BTK was frightening partly because his leaked less, he compartmentalized. He let one self hunt while the other self paid bills and attended church. That split made him harder to detect, not only socially but investigatively.